The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield, offering assisted living and compass memory support with evidence-based treatment for those with memory loss. More at armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. I'm Carrie Saldo. It's Friday, September 12th, 2025. We're here, gathered in the studios at NEPM, joined by Evan Garber, Vice President of A.L. Signoli, a political consulting firm that often works with Democrats, Greg Sukenik, the news editor of the Berkshire Eagle, and Nirvani Williams, a reporter here at NEPM. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
If you listeners have thoughts, you can email the rundown at nepm.org. That's the rundown at nepm.org. Coming up later in the show, education news, debating the pros and cons of new versus old school buildings, and the leaders of two colleges in the Berkshires announced their exits. Plus, 2026 could have a record number of ballot measures for voters to weigh in on, including one about rent control. But first, September 11th, 2001, where memorials were held across the region yesterday, 24 years after the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington. A column by Kevin Cullen in the Boston Globe caught my eye. Headline: Why aren't high school kids in Massachusetts being taught about 9/11? Quoting, on Thursday morning, the families of 219 souls with Massachusetts ties who died on 9/11 will gather at the State House, as they do every year, to mourn, to remember, and to celebrate the lives that were cruelly cut short 24 years ago. The piece goes on to say, but if the annual commemoration is dedicated to remembering something that happened in the past, the families of those lost that day are determined to ensure it continues to be remembered in the future. There are 14 states where teaching students about what happened on and after 9/11 is required, but Massachusetts, where the two planes that crashed into the World Trade Center took off, where so many families were affected by the wars that followed, is not one of them. So there's a whole generation of Massachusetts kids that grew up without the 9/11 story being required as part of their education. For me, this is a case of never assume. I sort of assumed that this was being taught in, at least at the high school level here in Massachusetts. Anybody else surprised that this is not being taught? Greg Sukenik?
I guess maybe because I was working that day at AP in Boston, I assumed everyone was aware of that. So I guess I never really stopped to think about whether that was taught in school. I just sort of figured, okay, people probably, at some point kids had questions for their parents. I guess my question would be how you frame the curriculum for that, because it's something very complicated, and you could either simplify it to the degree where it's practically Team America World Police, or you could overcomplicate it and bend over backwards so far that you get the MAGA curriculum cops coming your way, trying to figure out where the balance is. And I think that it's worthy, but I think striking the right balance is tricky.
I think there's maybe a starting point. The 9/11 Fund has a website, and they have some curriculum and resources that they have put up there, and some of them are in concert with our partner GBH News. So that's a start, perhaps. Evan, thoughts for you on that piece? Governor Healy has said she is supportive of an idea such as this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would hope that they, whatever curriculum, if it does come up, really tries to humanize it. We think about the statistics and numbers of it, and at the Spirit of Springfield 9/11 Memorial last night, Congressman Richard Neal pointed out this amazing column written by Cynthia Simison, former executive editor from the Republican, and she just wrote this beautiful piece about really humanizing it, and I would hope that there's some of that in whatever this curriculum might be.
I agree with that too. And I was also really surprised that this event wasn't being taught in schools, because not only was it immensely awful and horrific, but it influenced domestic and foreign policy, tightened our security in the country and at our borders. And I think that it can be taught responsibly, to your point, Greg, or your question, really. And I think the Massachusetts 9/11 Fund seems to be going in the right direction of wanting to educate students about Islamic extremists, but doing so in a way that doesn't perpetuate Islamophobia. I think that's key, and I think that it can be done in a responsible way. I think a lot of Massachusetts educators are really brilliant and can pull it off, but they should just at least be given the chance to do so first before anyone kind of comes after them.
Yeah, I think if a state is up to the challenge, it would be Massachusetts.
Kevin Cullen closed his piece by saying, quote, "History can be cruel, but we have to face it, just as the families who lost loved ones on 9/11 have to face it every day." All right, moving on to the 2026 ballot. I know, it seems a little premature to be talking about this, but the news is that Massachusetts voters could decide on a record number of ballot questions on the 2026 ballot. Katie Landon of GBH News, quoting here, "Voters could be deciding on a wide mix of consequential policy matters in the 2026 state election, from housing to taxes to election reforms. Among the proposed questions, several that speak directly to elections and government. Other proposals would undo the state law allowing the sale of recreational marijuana, lower the state's 5% income tax to 4%, and institute a statewide cap on annual rent increases." Quote, "I don't think there'll be that many at the end of the process," says Christopher Anderson, president of the Massachusetts High Technology Council. That's what he told GBH News. "But we certainly have this many to start with." Evan, a record number of ballot questions. What are you thinking?
Yeah, that really tells me from my political consultant kind of angle of that after the last session of the Massachusetts State Legislature, which was one of the one that got the least done, and then this current session, which doesn't seem to be faring too much better. I think it shows that Bay State voters and everyone here is really not thinking too highly of the legislature
There's
right now.
been this pattern in the legislature as of late where there's kind of a slow walk for much of the session and a rush
Right,
at the end of the session. And I think perhaps all these ballot questions that are proposed at this point is an indication that voters are frustrated with that.
Absolutely.
And also, I think people think about, like, isn't that a large part of the legislator's job to be pushing these policy measures forth? Well, among the topics I mentioned before is the topic of rent increases, and that drew a lot of news in recent weeks. We saw rallies in East Hampton, Northampton, and there is one reportedly planned in Springfield. Tenant advocates are saying that rent control is needed. The proposed 2026 ballot measure would limit annual rent hikes statewide to the cost of living increase measured by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, with a maximum cap of 5%. Katie Talbot, organizing director of Springfield No One Leaves, a grassroots housing advocacy organization in Springfield, says residents have experienced anywhere between $50 and $800 monthly rent increases as new property owners or corporate property owners have bought more properties in the city. I know that, Nirvani, you've done some reporting. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't surprise me that there's a push for rent control across the state because renters here and in places like Springfield, Northampton, Amherst, rent prices have been soaring. It's definitely an ambitious ballot measure, to say the least, since I feel like most people in these positions of power support landlords and real estate business owners and their ability to raise rents. But I think that it would be interesting to see a question on the ballot because people are suffering from not having any protections on how high landlords can raise their rent, and there are fewer affordable housing options. So I think as you were saying before too, people are really frustrated and they want to go to the ballots to try to see what they can do about it.
Greg Sukenik, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking, well, Pittsfield's had its own sort of response to homelessness going on. We've had an ordinance proposed that would prevent camping in public places. So this is clearly also an issue in the Berkshires. You might think we're a little more bucolic, but you think about South County, sort of having, sort of being a resort community, having higher rents, and Pittsfield and North Adams and Williamstown are not immune either. Just sort of a thought also about when you do legislation by ballot question, sometimes there's unintended consequences, and there's also an opportunity for the legislature to look at this and say, okay, so that's what people are interested in. Guess we'd better act. And sometimes that results sometimes they'll preempt that and maybe result in something that's maybe not as that's maybe a little more moderate than what the voters propose.
Yeah, and talk about unintended consequences. I mean, rent control was banned in 1994 from a ballot question, so here we are back with the same question, and I think it's kind of amazing.
Potentially full circle.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there's still a ways to go. There's signatures to be collected at 2 different benchmarks between now and the 2026 ballot. We'll be talking about this and many other potential ballot questions here on the Rundown. Switching gears, Greg Sukenik, a recent piece in the Berkshire Eagle. Here's how you put it, quote, "Let's talk about back to school energy." And a lot of adult time these days is being spent on back to school energy in the form of, should we keep the school buildings that we have, renovate them, or move on and create new school buildings? When you reported this, Pittsfield has a proposed redistricting map in Greg, the city's elementary schools, sort of on paper, theoretical exercise here for years, but now it's being talked about in more practical terms. What's going on?
What's going on is, there's broad agreement in Pittsfield that the west side of the city needs a new elementary school. The elementary schools that have served that part of the city are post-war. They've outlived their useful purpose. But they who control the checkbook make the rules, and the state business school building authority has said, okay, Pittsfield, you want a new school, so you need to be firm about how you're districting your elementary schools, and we need firm enrollment projections. So it came, when it came down to the potential for a vote on this to meet the October 1st deadline, suddenly there's questions of, well, are we going to close the smaller elementary school that's a little more in a remote position in the western side of the city, and that results in a 700 student elementary school serving most of the west side. So I mean, there's some big questions there for a city that's traditionally had smaller elementary school neighborhood schools, but there's financial pressure on those schools as well, and who knows what happens with the federal picture, how that changes. So it's kind of a moment of are we going to try to consolidate this and make it work so it doesn't feel like a 700 student elementary school, which feels big to me, or is there a way around that?
And Pittsfield is not alone here, right?
No.
Many of the cities and towns across Western Massachusetts have these smaller elementary school, community school models, and then maybe you have a more centralized middle and high school situation. So I feel like Pittsfield is very much a slice of what we see across what cities and towns across Western Massachusetts are grappling with, right?
Sure.
How to crack this nut in the face of the fact that people are having fewer kids. So you have fewer kids going to school. Can you justify having multiple elementary schools servicing fewer students?
Especially when those multiple schools are they're post-war construction and reaching the end of their useful life.
Nirvani, you took a look at the middle school proposal in Long Meadow this week. Tell us more.
Yeah, there was also similarly a the residents of Long Meadow voted to move forward with a $151 million project that would consolidate the 2 neighborhood middle schools in the town into one building. And there's been controversy over the $96 million cost residents will have to shoulder after a grant from the Massachusetts School Building Authority. And but the vote went through, and a majority of residents want this consolidated building to happen because the 2 middle schools and they're neighborhood middle schools, like you were saying. And so there's not really much change that would happen for the students realistically in this plan. They're looking to renovate the Williams Middle School on Williams Street and can make that a bigger building and bring the students from Glenbrook over to there. I think in this case, everyone's point is valid. $96 million is a lot of money for residents to pay over time. And the 2 middle schools are in desperate need of repair, as the school superintendent said. They need new HVAC systems and electric plumbing, just things that'll make us building run. So I do feel like the question is, whose best interest do we have in mind? And it seems like the residents have the students' best interest.
So next steps in Long Meadow, they're going to vote on exactly how to pay for this. So more news there. Pittsfield's going to continue talking about this too, a vote later this month. And we are going to head to our break here on The Rundown. When we come back, our panel on the latest news about the state's legal marijuana industry. Yet another tall tale there. Leaders of 2 Berkshire-based colleges announced their exits. And plus, if I manage the clock correctly, we'll have scoops, praise, and predictions. Stay with us. The Rundown returns on NEPM 88.5. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I'm Carrie Saldo, joined in studio by journalist Greg Sukenik and Nirvani Williams and political consultant Evan Garber. Let's get right back into it. There are a few different things to talk about on the cannabis front this week. An editorial in the Republican newspaper said, quote, "The delay is hard to justify. Nearly 7 years ago, Massachusetts began the legal sale of adult-use cannabis, but the Cannabis Control Commission is only now taking final public comments on how the state should regulate what's called social consumption of marijuana. A lot has changed in the industry since licensed vendors began to sell cannabis in November 2018. In all that time, social consumption sat on the horizon, but never drew closer for entrepreneurs who found their margins pinched as more and more outlets came online." The question that the Republican poses, I'm going to borrow, when the new rules for social consumption come, Evan, will anyone notice?
I mean, hopefully people will notice, and that amazing communities will prop up around these social consumption businesses. But I'm just not sure how it's going to shake out, because there was this August report that just came out from the state auditor's office citing the mismanagement and failures in hosting agreements, letting multi-state operations run amok in Massachusetts. So there's this leadership turmoil at the CCC has just kneecapped reform and has made everything a slog process, including social consumption, which really is a huge part of the social equity piece that this whole entire thing of legalizing cannabis in Massachusetts is supposed to be about, righting some of the wrongs from the war on drugs.
Social equity was a key piece, a key component of the legalized marijuana world here in Massachusetts. And because of all of the delay, basically what we have seen is there are very few social equity folks running cannabis businesses and benefiting from the funds and the business prowess that can be gained through this process. You'd mentioned some of the turmoil, Evan. I won't get into all of the as the world turns that has become the CCC, but the short version, a judge gave their take last week, and Globe columnist Kevin Cullum said, "Having read a judge's sobering take on the state of Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, I have just one question. What are they smoking up there? It can't be the good stuff, because if they were, they'd all be sitting around the office with beanbag chairs, eating Doritos and listening to Bob Marley and the Wailers instead of hurling insults and plotting against each other like a bunch of self-absorbed junior high school kids." Kevin, tell us how you think for real, brother. It's been an ugly, protracted battle between Treasurer Jeb Goldberg and former Commission Chair Shannon O'Brien, who a judge said last week is entitled to return to her job. The very brief on all of this is that Goldberg fired O'Brien. O'Brien challenged that decision. The judge says she should be reinstated, but it's not over yet. Goldberg says she is going to appeal that ruling, and all of this has had an impact on the industry, like we have talked about, in the terms of social equity. Greg Sukenik, what is all this making you think?
I'm thinking that this turmoil doesn't help because, it makes you question who's minding the store, the cannabis store in this case. And it's also interesting that we're talking about consumption, social consumption at a point where we've already seen the effects of having too many licenses. We've had a glut of cannabis and leading to lower prices and lower margin for retailers. And now we're going to add more licenses. And funny that this should come up only when we get to this point where we realize there's a glut. It kind of reminds me of how the lottery added Keno. That we have a revenue problem, so let's water down the market some more so we can add more revenue. It feels kind of desperate, and it makes you sort of wonder where the leadership has been.
Well, where the leadership has been a lot of infighting at this point, right?
Right.
So, I guess silver lining perhaps, this is settled or will be settled very shortly by the courts. Someone will be back leading the Cannabis Control Commission, and perhaps time to right the ship and get back on course here. Nirvani, any thoughts for you either about the infighting or the social consumption delay?
I have covered a panel that the commission had on social consumption, and the amount of time that it's taken them to just collect public comments on this is really interesting and fascinating, because it also seems like residents and people who are using who they want this, and they want like spaces where they can go to smoke
legally. Right? I mean, let's be very blunt about it. There are people socially consuming. Thank you, Greg Sukenik.
Absolutely.
But this would be much like a bar, right? You can go in, you have a glass of wine, and perhaps you'd sit and consume cannabis together in that type of setting. And there have been all sorts of questions about what are the implications for public safety if someone's leaving one of these establishments. So I think, the Cannabis Control Commission, state legislators have been erring on the side of caution because of that safety piece. But other states have done this, and it is working in other states. So I think perhaps there's an opportunity for Massachusetts to capitalize on that process. The other wrinkle in all of this, who knows? Because in 2026, this entire thing could become a moot point, because there's now a ballot question potentially coming that would roll back recreational marijuana as it is. So, all right, I'm going to move us on. Greg Sukenik, leaders of 2 higher education institutions in the Berkshires have announced their exits. You reported not on 1, but 2 people leaving higher education, Ellen Kennedy and the leader of MCLA, James Burge. What's going on?
Well, odd that they both happened on Tuesdays as well, so I'm worried about next Tuesday. So I don't think the president of Williams College is going anywhere.
The third and final
knock.
higher ed institution in the Berkshires.
Yes. Basically, both had been president of their institutions for 10 years or more, and it just one wonders about sort of the state of higher education and sort of attacks on higher education from the Trump administration. But in this case, it was both a case of veteran administrators who were ready to retire and felt that they were leaving their institutions in pretty good places. BCC, Berkshire Community College, has a 20% increase in enrollment. Thank you, Free Community College. MCLA, which has struggled a bit with its enrollment, has a slight uptick in its freshman class this year and feels like it's in a much better financial place than it was several years ago. So now the question becomes, okay, boards of trustees, how are we going to pick new presidents? And and they'll be happening not in a vacuum, but also in this environment where there's real challenges for higher education, not only potentially from the government, but also a demographic cliff that we're presently tumbling down. So it's going to be an interesting time and important decisions to be made on who's going to lead these institutions.
It was interesting to read in both of your pieces what wasn't discussed, which you mentioned, the Trump administration. Did either leader talk about the fact that they are seeing Harvard, Columbia, you name a larger higher ed institution going fisticuffs with the Trump administration? Are they feeling pressure from that?
They reference it somewhat, but to be honest, the focus really was on sort of, because they're both retiring and not moving on, the focus really was on sort of career and sort of how they had led their institution. And I think that's certainly, we've done some work on how that's going for those institutions. Williams in particular, because they've been involved in some lawsuits and some challenges. So that's something certainly to double back on.
Yeah, and also interesting at BCC and MCLA, to my knowledge or to my recollection, we didn't see some of the protests that we've seen about the war in Gaza at some of these other colleges.
There were some at
universities.
MCLA. I don't believe there were any at BCC.
And I remember
BCC
Williams did have some.
Williams did have some. BCC, very different institution from the other two.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts for either of you about state of higher ed here in Massachusetts, hearing these 2 leaders who've been there for a decade? It was interesting to hear Ellen Kennedy say, she wanted to leave now for the particular reason that BCC is on the precipice of doing its own strategic plan, and she didn't really want to have someone come in and need to foster and steward a plan that they weren't a part of building.
I would imagine that they'd want to try to avoid what happened with kind of the most recent high-profile higher ed change-up in Western Mass, which was the UMass chancellor, Javier Reyes, coming in, who had a no confident vote from the faculty senate and the student senate. And then kind of last February, I think it was NEPM who actually reported it. He was kind of caught looking for another job at West Virginia. So obviously these people are in really difficult, they're put in really difficult positions. in these roles, but they also have to be in it for the long run, I think, especially because here in Western Mass, higher ed is such a deep part of our economy and a part of our kind of image as a community.
And
I agree.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Nirvana. Go.
I was just going to say, I agree, and that I also think that this, especially as you were saying before, with federal pressures, it's making students, I think, just from reporting, react in really big ways, like exactly what you're saying about Javier Reyes and the protests around what's going on in Gaza. And I think that it'll really show whether the leadership can step up and face and address what's going on and speak to students' challenges, or if they'll just bow out gracefully or not so gracefully.
And one really quick note, MCLA is also one of the largest employers in North Adams. So that matters greatly, not only for the college, but for the community as a whole.
Yeah, and it's been interesting for MCLA to look at a variety of ways that it is ingraining itself into the community. It was last year, I believe, that the state looked at using what is a vacant dormitory to help with sheltering folks who need housing, and that found itself having a lot of pushback from the community. So to Evan's point, like that this is a huge part of the economy, but these educational institutions are also a massive part of the social fabric. It's not like these high gated walls around all these institutions. There are people living and working in our community, students, all of this. It's all one big ecosystem. I think it's important to keep that in mind. All right, we're going to head on to our scoop, praise, and prediction point in the show. I ask our panel to dish about a story that they're working on, maybe heap some praise on a newsworthy nugget, or be bold and make a prediction about the week's news. Greg Sukenik, you look like you're ready to go. Tell me, scoop,
I
praise,
practiced this one.
prediction.
This is praise/prediction.
Take your time.
Student journalism has never been more important, so I want to encourage students at every high school and college newspaper in Western Mass to learn and do great work this semester. Especially, I want to shout out to the Massachusetts Daily Collegian at UMass, my alma mater, because that's the reason I'm here. It's because what I learned there. So go get them, kids.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fascinating. I don't currently have an intern on this show, but certainly throughout my career here at NEPM, we have had a range of interns, and it's fascinating to me to watch what the interns learn while they're here. And then I keep in touch with a few who've gone on to journalism careers, and that feels especially rewarding for me to have that connection to those folks. Evan Garber, I know you probably don't have a scoop. Do you have a praise or a prediction that you would like to share with us this morning?
Maybe a scoopish prediction, which, tomorrow is the Massachusetts Democrat State Committee will be in Springfield. And maybe if you hang out around White Line Brewery in the evenings, you'll get to see some top-level Democrats from Western Mass and around the states hanging out. So.
And it's been quite a few years since the convention was held here in Springfield.
I believe it was 2019 was the last time it was held in Springfield. So we'll see what comes out from that. But yeah, hang around downtown Springfield. You might catch a glimpse of your congressperson or senator. 2
consecutive weekends here in Springfield with very different glittery type things. I think last weekend LeBron James was hanging out because of the Basketball Hall of Fame induction. Yes, and shiny Democrats perhaps in Springfield this week. Nirvani, how about for you? Scoop, praise, prediction. What's on your mind this week?
I have just some praise for Belmonte, and Khalees Smith of the 413. I was hanging out with them on Tuesday and interviewing all of the mayoral candidates in Northampton for the preliminary coming up.
How many candidates are running there? It's quite a few.
It's including the incumbent 4.
Wow.
So they interviewed Gina Louise Shera on Friday.
Incumbent
in Northampton, and then the 3 other candidates on Tuesday, all back to back, which I was able to be a part of and interview them for the newsroom. And I think they did quite a beautiful job putting these interviews together. It was really difficult to do all one after the other, and really kind of hard to get first impressions right off the bat from new candidates coming up and cropping up. But I'm interested to see who who the residents vote in.
Lots of
next
info
week.
there for listeners who
Yes.
are engaged in that race in Northampton.
NEPM.org.
I have praised this week for an interesting story that I read about in The Republican. Stasi Haropoulos reporting on a Western New England University use of an AI chatbot it's helping students navigate their academic experience. Not the biggest fan of AI yet, but I thought that was an interesting one. Give it a read. All right, I want to thank our panel this morning, Greg Sukenik, Evan Garber, and Nirvana Williams. This is The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I'm Carrie Saldo. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. Maybe hit the biggie. Take care,
Friday.
everybody.